I'm not an economist, but I play one in front of a classroom. Yeah, so there's a couple of problems here. First of all, I'm not Sam Peltzman, and second of all, I'm standing between you and dinner. So, but I will try to keep you entertained before you get too hungry. And I built this presentation on the idea that most of you have some prior thoughts about this, and I'm assuming that along the way you will interrupt me with suggestions, comments, or questions. As long as you do so in an orderly fashion, that'll be great. Okay, so let me begin here. I presume that most of you know who that lady is up there at the top left. Approximately 3 years ago, the housing issue, or the economics of the housing issue, became a very, very big deal in Israel. It turned out that the protests went a little bit broader than that. Daphne Leaf had a broader agenda that included raising taxes, ending privatization, increasing state ownership, increasing state budgets, and otherwise shrinking the economy. But it began, and perhaps the most vital issue that was presented during the protests were the real estate issues, or right down here, right, fighting for people's homes. Right? Now, there's no doubt that real estate prices in Israel are high by some measures. Right? One of the things we're going to have to talk about is that it's difficult to know exactly how it is that we want to measure these things. But one standard measure that's often cited in the press, and it's not a terrible one, right, is to measure the price of real estate as compared to annual income or monthly income, and then compare it in Israel to different countries, right? So here's a story from about 1.5 years ago, and it's roughly the same figures today, that compared to the other countries in the OECD, Israelis pay roughly double their percentage of their salaries, right? You need 191 months of income to pay for a 5-room apartment, which is double the OECD average of 96 months, right? That's a substantial amount. Now, there's another related debate that often goes on, which is sometimes confused with this debate about whether are the prices high. That's one debate. There's a second debate that's constantly going on, which is whether there is a bubble in real estate valuations. Right now, if you look at these headlines, you can see that this debate goes back a number of years. Right, so 10 years ago, you would see headlines telling us we should be concerned. There is a bubble in real estate valuations. Do you know what a bubble is? You know what a bubble is. What is a bubble?
Blunt and grows beyond real financial worth.
Yeah, there's something like that, right? The most famous bubble ever was the tulip bubble, right? Where tulips were selling on the exchange. I guess the equivalent price in today's dollars would be for something like $125,000 per bulb, right? And it's fairly clear that there's no way that any buyer will ever get $125,000 of value from a single flower, right? A bubble is where the prices of the good no longer reflect the amount of utility that people think they can consume from the good. It instead reflects an apparent expectation that there's some other idiot out there who's willing to pay yet more, right? And so you have these questions about, and that we've seen in the not too distant past, what can happen when a real estate bubble collapses, right? There was apparently a real estate bubble in the United States that collapsed with some degree of economic harm about 6 years ago. Right? And so you have these questions, do we have a bubble here? There just was a report that came out from the International Monetary Fund that claims that there's reasonable grounds to suspect that there is a real estate bubble in Israel. Right? That if one compares the fundamental value of real estate in Israel to the prices that are in the market, they say there seems to be some inflation of about, they say about 20%, right, or 25%. On the other hand, there's also studies that tell us no, in fact, there's no bubble, right? You have this interesting study by Akir Plessner that says, well, the best way to measure whether there's a bubble or not is to compare the prices of real estate in the rental market to the prices in the purchasing market. Why? In the rental market, you're presumably not going to be able to resell the asset, and so you won't be able to benefit from the stupidity of other people who are going to overpay. Right? And if the prices for buying real estate are tracking the prices for renting real estate, and he says that they're pretty stably tracking one another, then that shows us that, in fact, there is no bubble. So maybe there is no bubble. Maybe there is a bubble. One of the difficult things here is to figure out what the fundamental price of real estate is. Right? It might be that prices are high and there is no bubble, and it's always very difficult to know because in a competitive market for real estate, what you'll ultimately expect is that the marginal revenue that people will receive from selling their units will be equal to the marginal cost. Now, what is the marginal cost? What is the cost of a real estate unit? It's the cost of the land plus the cost of building whatever you have on the land. Right? Now, the cost of construction, that's very easy to calculate. The cost of the land, on the other hand, is a very difficult thing to calculate. Right? They're not making very much of it these days. Right? So we don't really know how much it costs to produce a unit of land. Right? And we have, therefore, these endless debates about what is the fundamental value of real estate. But I think if you can say, whether there's a bubble or not, it's a pretty fair bet that we're paying a high price for real estate in Israel. Now, what is the result of high real estate prices? Again, feel free to jump in at any point. Please do. Yeah.
With regard to your picture of looking at prices relative to Israeli incomes,
Yes.
I'm just wondering about the reasonable comparing the Israeli market to like a typical market in American City, where overwhelmingly the purchases are made by residents. Whereas here, in terms of when they live in Yerushalayim, if I look at the neighborhood where I live in Yerushalayim,
Right.
there's an enormous percentage of who is purchasing these properties.
Right.
Because money is coming in from Hazaras. So I'm wondering.
I have a rant dedicated just to that issue that I'm going to get to in a moment. But in the meantime, I'll tell you that there are actually a lot of markets in the OECD countries where there are much larger percentages of foreign buyers than there are in Israel. Right? So think northern Italy. Okay? Think Bellagio. Right? New York, Paris, London. They have huge numbers of foreign investors in real estate. Right? So it's
Residential?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's why we call one of these things excuse me for my horrible French pronunciation, pied-à-terre, right? Because yes, there's a huge market like this in Paris for residential units where people don't live. Yeah. Did you have a question or? Objection?
Only know if there was a bubble or no, or yes or no after first.
Pardon?
You can only know if there was a bubble only after.
Well, that's the way to be certain, right? Everybody's a genius after it happens. Before it happens, well, you know, there's well, who was it? Was it Paul Samuelson who said that, made the comment that so-and-so is a genius? He's picked 7 out of the last 4 depressions. Pardon? Right, 7 out of the last. The stock market has picked out 7 of the last 4 recessions. Right. In other words, there are people who specialize in finding doom. Right, and so if you predict doom all the time, then at the end of every downturn, you're a genius, and then you're stupid for a few years until the next time you're a genius. It's very difficult to predict these things. The person who was the genius this time around, who won his Nobel Prize last year, was Robert Shiller. Right, he has some fairly good models on valuing the fundamental value of real estate, and stated, I think, fairly explicitly that the market was overvalued. Most everyone else was just predicting doom. Yeah.
One more is houses in Israel expensive in all of Israel or just in some parts?
Well, prices are up and down everywhere, and so obviously land prices are not equal across any country, and they're not equal in Israel either. Right? That said, the way you do these kinds of things, again, what are we trying to figure out? We're trying to figure out the fundamental value of real estate as opposed to the value it's getting in the market. What is the fundamental value? It is the cost of construction plus the cost of the land. Right? The farther away you get from where jobs are, the less the land is worth. Right? The construction should be the same price. The land should be much cheaper. That said, it's very difficult to calculate the price of land. I'm not convinced there is a bubble. On the other hand, there's some reasonably good economists in the International Monetary Fund who think otherwise. Okay, now whether there is a bubble or whether there is not, prices are high, and that causes a number of problems. It causes, besides the fact that people have a difficult time buying residential units, right? They have a difficult time paying for where they live. It causes other distortions in the market. Right? So one of the things that it causes is if you pay a lot for one consumption good, right? If you're paying an unusually large portion of your salary for real estate, then you are probably substituting that consumption for other consumption that you could be doing. Right? You're buying. We're shifting consumption to housing where it could be more profitably done elsewhere, right? People could be consuming resources that they would rather have than this expensive housing. Yeah?
Why the meta allocation? Where's the high? Allocation, why is that wrong? Why
Well, if it's a, what do we mean that prices are high? We mean that prices are not reflecting what a free competitive market would bring. Yes? There are other reasons why prices will be high besides a bubble, which I will get to in a moment. Right? In fact, actually, I can come back to the IMF report in a moment and tell you they actually agree with what I'm about to say, even though they, aside from the fact that they think there's a bubble. Right? Now, there's another kind. There are all sorts of markets that, once you have one distorted market, it ends up distorting other markets. High real estate prices increase consumption of housing, decrease consumption of other goods. It also distorts labor markets, right? Where people live greatly affects where they end up working. If they are driven away from certain areas, that ends up influencing their choices of labor. Right? And so we may be driving them to less productive jobs. there are a lot of ways in which a distorted real estate market can distort all sorts of other items. Now, I'm going to right now start my little rant about the protesters' suggestions. But before I do so, actually, let me just go back and tell you what I wanted to say about the IMF report. So the IMF report says there's a bubble in real estate. Now, it's likely, even though it's a fairly small bubble, right? 25% overvaluation, they suggested that it could lead to a very large shock in the Israeli economy if it were to collapse. And they say that there's a 20% chance of it collapsing in the next 5 years. Now, why would it cause such a big shock? The reason they say it would cause such a big shock is that there are elements of the market that are relatively rigid, right, that can't adjust. And in particular, they singled out supply rigidity. Right? Now, there is supply rigidity in Israel. I think that it has nothing to do per se with a bubble. It's not even clear why in their model this is the major problem of a bubble. If there's some sort of collapsing demand, then actually the supply rigidity is not the greatest of our problems. But there is a lot of supply rigidity in Israel, and that is the real estate problem. Right? But we'll get to that in a moment. First, let me rant. Okay, so here's my rant about what the protesters wanted. Now, what the protesters suggested was a whole bunch of ideas that are designed to make the problem worse, except they didn't understand that. So basically what they suggested were the kinds of things that would increase demand and lower supply, right? Which will have what effect on the prices? Yeah, okay, yeah. You're right, it belongs in both. I should have put it here and here. Right. There's a little bit there's a judgment call involved here in my division between demand and supply, but work with me and we'll get through all of them. Okay. Let's start with the first one. Right. The first one gets back to what Bob was talking about here, which was the question of whether there's some significant distortion as a result of foreign demand for land. Right? Now, there's no doubt that foreign demand for land, like all other demand, all things being equal, the greater your quantity demand, right? It'll drive up your prices. There's something interesting about trying to depress foreign demand for land, which is that if you drive out foreign buyers, you're basically driving out their capital. They're not going to substitute their consumption with something else in your country. They'll just take their money and leave. Right? It is one of the great products for export, real estate, because they can't take it anywhere. They bring their money here, and they leave the asset here. And then they pay taxes for the privilege of leaving the money and the asset here, right? So it may well be that if you can drive out all foreign demand for land, this is one thing that'll actually lower demand, right? Should lower prices. The price of this is enormous, right? It's very difficult to think of a more expensive way of driving down demand. Now, for the rest of these, we don't even have that. We can't even say that they drive down demand. They clearly will increase demand, right? So if the state subsidizes mortgages, for example, for first-time buyers or for second-time buyers, what is the result? It makes it cheaper for them to buy. Therefore, they will use them. You will expect the prices to rise. Yeah?
Has it actually been quantified? For example, in Israel, a lot of people own apartments that they only use 1 or 2 weeks out of the year. So the value they add to the economy for whatever purchases they make during that time, to see if the purchases they make would actually be more or less than what the added money Israelis would have if they had lower rents. Well,
what I would measure is not the question. It's not a question of the purchases they're making during those 2 weeks that they're present, which is minimal and not really relevant. The question is the purchase that they're making by taking $500,000 and sending it to some Israeli to have their name written as the nominal owner of something for which they continue to pay taxes thereafter, right? That's the major economic contribution that they make. And they don't consume services either, right? So here they'll pay municipal taxes for the privilege of owning something where they won't use the schools, they don't use the roads, they don't use the water, they don't use any of the infrastructure for which they're going to be paying, right? There's resort towns in Italy are very wealthy for a good reason. Right? But no, I'm not sure of. I'm not aware of any study that's quantified the benefit to Israel from foreign demand for real estate. Although it would be a great study. Okay, mortgage subsidies. We talked about the rent subsidies. Same thing, except it'll drive up the prices in the rent market. Right? If you're paying people to consume, then you'll drive up demand and drive up the prices. If you subsidize the purchase of land in development towns, you'll drive up the prices of land in the development towns. Right? Now, there's some things that they suggested on the supply side. They either have no effect on supply or reduce supply, and if they have no effect on supply, for the most part, what they do is make sure that the quality of the product goes down. So, for example, they suggested building public housing, or subsidizing housing that's specifically designated for the rental market. Right? This, by the way, there is a study. Subsidizing housing designated for the rental market, they actually did a study. There was a, in Tel Aviv, there was a study having to do with a benefit that Tel Aviv, the municipality of Tel Aviv gave to real estate developers that dedicated a certain percentage of their units for real estate housing. And the result, the study showed that the result was a 25% decline in the value of the real estate. Right? It's basically taking 25% of the value of the real estate and destroying it. Right? That's the these kinds of things you can expect. They're basically a good way of destroying Israeli wealth, right? Destroying the value of assets. Rent control, right? Rent control affects two things. Rent control drives certain units out of the market, right? If you cannot get a high enough price to justify renting, then you don't rent, right? It also brings demand into the market, right? It brings the buyers in to try to get this attractive price. The result is a constant shortage that, instead of being allocated by price, is allocated by other things, like waiting time, or personal connections, or some other way of making the quantity demand equal to quantity supply when price can't do the work. Right? And we have lots of experience with this in the world, with rent control, right? So in places where there are rent control, where there still is rent control, like, for example, New York City, you have vacancy rates that are less than zero, right? That is, you have a constant shortage. The concentration of land use planning and district committees, the idea is they were very, very upset at certain kinds of land planning techniques that would allow skirting the usual process and planning for more units. What they want is to make sure that planning is slow and produces a limited number of units to save the environment. Now, there's a result of that, and the result is there's less units that end up getting built and put on the market. Right? Overall, I think you can say there's not a single thing here that would lower real estate prices, except one that would do so at an enormous cost to the economy. And a lot of things here that would either raise prices or lower quality, or both. Okay, now, if we wanted to think about this more logically than they did, what are the things in the Israeli economy that lead to high prices for real estate? Now, some of these are actually focused on the in the IMF report. They talk in particular about the mortgages, this whole thing they talk about as supply rigidity, but we'll unpack that and talk a little bit about what is the supply rigidity. But let's start on the demand side. There are already ways that we subsidize demand and raise prices, right? So there are mortgage subsidies already, right? There are mortgage subsidies for first-time buyers. There's mortgage subsidies in certain areas. There's mortgage subsidies for people who've gone through the Army, et cetera, right? Lots of different kinds of mortgage subsidies that are available. What the IMF report talked about as well was mortgage rates, just the fluctuating rates of interest in the market affect demand as well, and they have. Right? What I'm more interested in, though, is the way in which we subsidize demand. Maybe it's not a smart thing to do if we're trying to lower prices. There's another issue, which is tax incentives. Now, this is maybe the one thing where Israel's actually done something right in the last year. So it's not nearly as big a problem as it used to be. But I'll tell you what the problem is, and then we'll see if we can understand why it is a problem. So in Israel, there is maybe the very best tax break in the code is the tax break that one gets for the sale of residential units, right? Or eligible residential units. Eligible residential units means a residential unit of any size, so long as one has not sold any other residential unit during the prior 4 years or 1.5 years, depending on how many real estate holdings you have. Now, what does this mean? What this means is that if you buy stock and then sell it after 5 years in a handsome profit, then you pay capital gains tax. Right? If you invest in any business, you will pay capital gains tax. If you invest in a ridiculously ostentatious luxury apartment, right? And remember, because you can only use this once every so many years, it's much better to have one ridiculously ostentatious apartment than several where you use one and rent out the others, right? The one overpriced, over-luxurious apartment gives you a complete tax break. Right? For that one, you buy it, you sell it at the end, all of your capital gains are tax-free. Right? It is a great tax shelter. Now, it's been changed recently. So this is the one thing that, you can say, well, maybe we've done something right in the last year. But it's so long as that was around, and still partially around, what it does is it tells people not only should they, when they're considering whether to invest in real estate or in making widgets, they should invest in real estate. It also tells them that when they're investing in real estate, what they should invest in is the most overblown, overexpensive, ostentatious apartment they can find, because that's the biggest tax shelter. Yes?
Can you repeat, please, why it is a tax break in this case?
Because the way the tax break works is all of the capital gains one gets upon selling the unit are tax-free. They're all free. Right? You pay zero tax. You don't pay 20% tax or 25% tax or whatever you might pay on other sorts of capital gains. You pay zero. That means that even if you have a much smaller return, it's still worthwhile for you to invest in it, right? That's the way that it worked until now, basically, is anytime one sells a residential unit, whether you lived there or you did not live there, you could use the tax break as long as you hadn't used a similar tax break either in the last year and a half or the last 4 years, depending on what category you fall into. Right? Basically, every 4 years, if you wanted, you could sell another residential unit and get all your capital gains tax-free. Yes?
Why are you saying buy the most ostentatious largest? It's the one that goes up the most.
Right. I want to shelter the largest capital gain. Right.
You're not going to get
but
much capital gain from the buying a very overpriced house.
what I don't want it to be overpriced. But what I do want it to be, pardon? Pardon?
You want it to be underpriced so you can sell it.
Right, of course I want to get the large capital gain, but I can only shelter the gain in one unit every 4 years. So between buying 2 units of $1 million each or buying 1 unit of $2 million, it's clearly better for me to buy the 1 unit of $2 million, right? That way I can shelter the larger gain. And it may be that even if the $2 million unit is going to appreciate less than those 2 $1 million units, it's still worth it for me to buy that larger one, right? There's a reason that Ehud Barak bought this ridiculously expensive apartment in Tel Aviv for whatever it was, $30 million, and then sold it 4 years later, right? He had a good accountant. Yeah.
If you make it hard to buy, you can sell the apartment, that doesn't increase the price.
Pardon?
If you make it hard to buy, expensive to buy an apartment, well,
Right.
but there's no taxes on selling, then that would increase the price. Because you have more people willing to sell their apartment.
No. What you have here is an incentive to consume apartments as opposed to other investment vehicles. Now, where?
Taxes on buying apartments for investment.
Pardon?
There's taxes on buying apartments for investment.
What taxes?
To buy an apartment for an investment,
Whether you buy it as an investment or not, you pay a certain consumption tax, right? There's an acquisition tax.
if it's just selling an apartment, there'll be more taxes and the rules are.
It's right. So there's been a reform regarding the entire tax incentive structure, right? But let's just take my word for it. Until now, was basically the best tax shelter you could find in the Israeli tax code. There was nothing even close to it. Okay? All right, that's on the demand side. And that, by the way, this is the small stuff. Now we get to the big stuff, the supply rigidity. Okay? And this is the stuff that mainly I want to talk about. Number one, I'm sure you know this. The state owns or manages basically all of the land in Israel, right? 93% of the land. Problem number one. Problem number two. The way the state manages the land use in Israel, you basically can't do anything. We'll talk about that in a moment. Now, there are other things that we're not going to talk about so much, but there's a highly restrictive labor market in the construction industry, and there are cartels in the construction materials, such as concrete, right? And those two, right, if you're talking cost of land, cost of construction here can get higher than it needs to be. Although here here, you know, the way things look, it seems like cost of land is a larger portion of the problem than cost of construction. So I'm going to focus on these two. Okay. Well, good. Yeah.
My question is, so would you say that maybe the market prices right now, because of the availability of cheap homes in Judea and Samaria, maybe undervalue homes in central Israel because, you know, something like several 100,000 Israelis are living in really low-priced homes when they would otherwise be in the north or the south or the center?
Yeah, there's greater supply rigidity over the green line than there is inside the green line for kind of obvious political reasons, right? It's very, if you think about, let's say, land use issues, right? Land use issues over the green line are much worse than they are inside the green line. And as a result, there's actually greater real estate price appreciation over the green line than there is inside the green line. It's not that there's cheaper housing over there. There's actually the prices are accelerating much more rapidly over the green line than they are inside the green line. Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you could clarify what you meant by restrictions in the labor supply. Do you mean that there's a lack of available laborers to build these homes, or?
Yeah. So what's happened over the years is traditionally the labor supply in the construction market was foreign laborers of various kinds, right? Palestinians at one point, then Romanians, then Thais, and then, you know, and each time there's some sort of political movement to stop this labor force from entering because of some other reason. And then there's a shock in the labor market, and then there's some new source that's brought online. That's what I'm talking about. Yeah.
So you said you're going to focus on the state issues, which
Yes.
often people discuss. You know, the government is the issue, but it seems like even before you get into it, it seems like an easier thing to deal with possibly would be report one of the cartels in construction material and the actual construction being done, that if you just penalize people for abusing the system, then they would stop or they would not be in the system, and it would force people to act in a more...
You can't penalize a cartel. You can open up the market to competition. I'm not really sure how you penalize people for being in a cartel resolves the cartel. Right? If you have, you can attempt to stop collusive pricing, right? But in this case, since there's actually one concrete supplier in Israel, it's really hard to figure out how you're going to do that, right? No, it's true that the cartels, the monopolies in construction materials are a likely target for reform. As a portion of price, I'd suggest they're probably a lot smaller than the portion of, you know, the exaggerated prices of land. And I don't know if they're so easy politically. They're really hard politically. But I agree, they're actually great targets to attack. Okay, or do I get to start with? Okay, so let's start with state ownership of land. So this is just, compare a point of comparison about the amount of public lands here means basically state-owned or managed. Israel versus the U.S., we could pick out any Western country and you'll see basically the same thing, right? Israel has 93% that's under the control of the Israel Lands Authority, 82% state lands, and then another roughly 11%, which is the Jewish National Fund lands, which are managed by the state and basically managed as state lands. There's nothing like this anywhere else in the Western world. Nothing even close, right? In Singapore, I think there's somewhere around 55%, which is state land, which is enormously high. The United States is actually high, right? It's 40%. You get to Europe and the numbers are much, much smaller, right? I just saw it, but I wasn't able, I was looking at some numbers today. I wasn't able to verify whether there's actually, I saw an article that claimed that in Bulgaria, 98% of the land is private. Now that seems to me probably exaggerated, but the numbers in Europe are extremely small, right? The amount of public land. 93% is just something that's unheard of in this world. Okay. Now, even in Singapore, right? Singapore, where you have 50-something% state ownership, there's the natural result, right? Which is land prices in Singapore are outrageous. Right? Now, why does state ownership lead to such high prices? Well, the best answer I can give you, yeah.
What is the historic reason for this situation?
In Singapore?
No, in Israel. That the state owns the entire land.
Some of it is because of the way the state came into being. Some of it is because of the socialist vision of certain people in the founding generation. And some of it is for some arguments that I'll talk about in a few minutes.
Okay. No, because
the socialists, I mean, the Labour Party, I mean, they moved from power like maybe 40 years ago, so why isn't it changed already?
When it comes to land issues, the right wing may be just as populist or even more populist than the Labour Party. Maybe more populist. But we'll talk about that in a moment. First, I want to talk about what it is that state ownership of land does. Right? What is it that it does? So the best story that I can tell you, best meaning like this is the smallest amount of harm that I can imagine from this, is that, and this does happen in Israel, right? You have the Israel Lands Authority is charged with maximizing the price it gets from selling or renting out state lands, right? Now, what does that mean? If they're basically the only person, they're the only actor in the market who can put land out there for sale, then they have monopoly power, and they use it like monopoly power. Now, if you've studied, sort of economics 101, then there's a certain the way a monopoly maximizes revenue is it restricts output and raises prices, right? Why a monopolist is able to do this as opposed to a competitive market? It's because the monopolist basically can deal with every buyer and not worry about alienating them, right? It can discriminate in prices. The competitive market, you're more or less stuck with the price. You deviate from it, you're out of the market, right? Somebody else takes your market share. Now the result is pretty clear, right? The result is in a monopoly market, they're going to lower the output, raise prices. That's what they do, right? So we have less state lands going out to the market and a higher price that's asked for. Now that's the best story I can tell you. Now, I should add to that, they're not actually perfect monopolists, right? They are not. The Israel Lands Authority doesn't handle its monopoly power the way a private corporation would, right? They handle it the way a government office does, which means that there's a little what's the expression? Feather lining? What do you? Feather bedding, right? There's a little bit of a feather bedding. Pardon? It's nest building, right? What you have in government offices. The truth is that this can happen in corporations as well. But you have a problem that the people that you send out there as your agents to do things may not always be so interested in what you want them to do. They may be more interested in what's good for them. Right? And what's good for them may be to make their work conditions comfortable, to maximize their decision-making authority, maybe to every once in a while, not that such things happen in Israel, but, take bribes. That doesn't happen. But, there are things, that happen when you empower officials to make decisions that are worth a lot of money. And that's what happens here. Things slow down. You have a lot of turf wars. You have a lot of petty bureaucrats demanding that you come back tomorrow maybe to see if anything's happened, or next week, or after the holidays, next year. And sometimes, envelopes pass between people, or between people and their secretaries, or people and their brothers. Again, not that such things ever happen in Israel. Right? So there's worse things that can happen than just simply monopoly pricing. What you can have is actual corruption or other straight-out distortions of the market that result in high prices, low supply, and wasted resources. Okay. Now, there's lots and lots of stories out there. If you want to look out in the world, we have empirical evidence of state ownership of land being expensive and unsuccessful. Yeah, we've got lots of them, right? So take a look at the land market in Mexico, which, by the way, still has some problems like this, right? In 1917, there was a change in the Mexican Constitution that required the state ownership of all lands, as a result of which it basically killed the real estate market. It wasn't, by the way, only real estate. There were other state resources that had to be controlled and owned by the state. It's, for example, still the case with oil. Oil in Mexico, oil company until recently, it's now beginning to change, had to be owned by the state. The result is that Mexico, despite having great oil resources, has very low oil output. Right? In real estate, until 1992, you couldn't you couldn't own real estate except if you were the state. Now there's still some restrictions within, I believe, 50 miles of the coastline or 100 miles of the land border. You cannot own land if you're a private individual. What this means is that if you want to get to land, what you have to do is what's done here. You lease it, in this case from a trust. Right? A trust has to acquire it. There are these bank trusts that own the land in these coastal areas in cooperation with the state, and they lease it to foreign investors. And the result is that you have a very bureaucratic and bribe-ridden process which kills the real estate market. Maybe that will change, right? If you want other examples, you look at the Arab monarchies, who are the biggest landholders in the world, right? They're monarchs who own all the land in their state. Don't hold up Saudi Arabia as the example of a great real estate market, right? It's not. Okay, but all right, there's lots and lots of examples of bad state ownership, and there is, again, no place in the West, no place in the successful economy where there's anything like 93% ownership like there is in Israel. Okay. That's issue number one. Yes?
But if Israel has like 93% and it sells so slowly, it's less and less.
Yeah, so one of the things that I have to talk about is there's a reform going on right now where Israel is slowly selling off its urban real estate holdings, right? If the way it works now under the reform is that if you have a long-term lease in an urban area and certain kinds of buildings, then the Israel Lands Authority will transfer to you ownership. And the reform is expected in the next, I believe, 10 years to result in a huge change where instead of 93% of the state being owned by the land of the state being owned by the Israel Lands Authority, it will only be 91%.
But for years people are buying land, or they're just leasing.
Leasing.
Only leasing.
Yes. In some cases, not even leasing. Right? In some cases, all you get is a license to reside there. A license to construct and to reside there. Right? That's everything over the Green Line, for example. You can't get a lease. You certainly can't get ownership.
So you pay like that $250,000 only to lease it, or
and over the Green Line, what you pay is you pay a fee to have the right to live there. That's all you have. You have a limited license. Yeah.
Why is like long-term leasing not enough? Can you explain the difference between like Israel selling the land and Israel long-term leasing it? Why does the state have to sell it?
Well, there's a few major differences between long-term leasing and ownership. So one of them is that long-term leases end. Right? As a result, there's a period of uncertainty. The closer you get to the lease, the more valuable the land is after the lease. Right now, what that does, if you want an easy way to calculate what the effect and values is, go to areas of the country where there are large land holdings by the Greek Orthodox Church.
My house is on one, I know.
Okay, so the Greek Orthodox Church doesn't sell its land, it only leases it. And you may be aware of this, but it sells at a discount to the rest of the market. Right? That is, Greek Orthodox land is less valuable than regular ownership because there's uncertainty. Right? You don't know what will happen. And the closer you get to the end of the lease, the greater the discount is compared to the rest of the market. That's one of the items. The other item is, and this is a huge item, is the lease specifies terms. You want to change things, you have to go back and get permission, right? And the Israel Lands Authority is not shy about demanding payment for permission, right? So if you want to do construction on leased land, you have to not only go through and get from the Land Use Authority's permission, you have to go and get permission from the Israel Lands Authority, right? And sometimes they'll definitely agree for a set price, and sometimes you have to go through extensive negotiation, and sometimes it just won't happen at all, right? Sometimes you just can't do it as a result of their control over the land use. Yeah?
So in Israel, when you're buying or selling a property, is it like obligated to say, oh, this is the price, and in small print, there's 2 years left on my like Israel Lands Authority lease?
Well, if you go check the land registry, you'll find that information. There are buyers with varying degrees of sophistication out there, but when you get to the point where you start laying out a huge amount of money, right? 191 months worth of salary on something, believe me, you're going to read the fine print.
And usually how long is it for, like a century lease, or is it?
Leases are generally for 49 years. The Greek Orthodox Church sometimes does leases for 99 years. Yeah.
If somebody wanted to lower the prices of real estate, then they'll increase the supply. Maybe they just don't want to, because people gain from high prices of real estate.
Yeah, one of the things that happens with the Israel Lands Authority is it makes money by restricting supply. Right? So yes, it wants high prices.
So nobody wants to make real estate prices lower.
Pardon?
Then nobody wants to make prices lower. Because if somebody wants to, you see
the Israel Lands Authority is unlikely to lead to the lowering of prices, yes. I agree. And whether that's good for the economy, I think it's bad for the economy, but it's good for the Israel Lands Authority. Yeah.
Once a lease expires, you have to pay again.
Yeah, you have to buy a new lease.
So this is not actually buying anything. You're just spending twice the amount of money buying rental, essentially. You're renting the land for twice the amount that it would cost to buy something else.
Presumably, if all things add up, the prices should be pretty close. That is, you should pay less at the outset for a 99-year or 49-year lease than you would for absolute ownership. Now, because there's some, if you do the math, by the way, you'll figure out what's the value of something worth something 49 years down the line. It's fairly small compared to its value today.
In other words, you're not saying that the lease is the problem as compared to a purchase. You can actually interchange leases and purchases. You're saying that the lease has conditions attached to it that make it more difficult to transact.
Well, there's two issues with the lease. One is the uncertainty about the end period, but the other thing, yes,
you are buying that for less price.
Right. So, depending on the amount of certainty. I mean, there happens to be greater certainty with the Israel Lands Authority than there is with the Greek Orthodox Church. Right. And for that reason, the discount is much smaller. Right. But the major thing is the conditions that come with the lease.
You have to ask for changes. You have to ask.
Right. Now, the conditions are generally what you bought it for, but the thing is, markets change, demands change, needs change. Yeah.
What is the alternative of the Israeli land authorities, by your opinion?
Sell it.
Sell it? Everything?
Whatever the state does not need.
To offer all the lands?
Pardon?
To offer all the lands in...
all the lands that the state does not need for itself, for army training areas, for parks, for whatever else the state needs it for, yes, sell it. It'll be awful. It'll be a real estate market. It'll be a private market. It'll be just like buying cars. Yes.
But currently the state is profiting from leasing the land that it owns, and it is reluctant to sell it. So is there any way that to force the state to sell it?
Well, yeah, sure there is.
So what are they, and why?
I mean, the state, I give you, the best case scenario is the state is looking to make money, right? But the state is not looking to make money.
right? But the state, how not? How government's not looking to make money?
For a very simple reason, that they can't take home their profits. Right? The Israel Lands Authority, if they have a great year and make a lot of money, they're not going to take home any more money than they do if they have a lousy year. Right? It's a very poor incentive. Right? There's reasons why, you know, there are other things that go on in government decision making besides just how you maximize your profits. And by the way, there's still, if I'm right, if you can get the land to valuable use by getting out in the private market, it would be worth it to bribe them to get rid of the land, to sell it. You'd still have enough after the bribe to don't make money besides. All right, let me go forward to the other item that I really wanted to discuss. There's a lot of stuff also out there about land use, about the way land use regulations affect real estate prices. It's pretty, you know, the more restrictive the planning regime is, very clearly, the more restrictive supply is, and the higher the price of real estate is. It's, you know, this is not rocket science. Okay. Now, there's in Israel, there's a particularly restrictive system. It's particularly restrictive, I think, as a result of the way the rules are set up and of the way the people understand what the rules are supposed to make them do. Right? So Israel's land planning regime is restrictive, extremely restricted in the following sense. In Israel, as opposed to most of the Western world, you cannot do. I teach this case every year, and I still can't remember its name. There is a line in the case where Wittgen says that the way the land planning use works in Israel, you cannot put a nail and an outside wall unless you have land use authority, right? Unless it's permitted by all the relevant things. You have to have an appropriate national plan, district plan, local plan, and you have to have a building permit that was taken out for which you paid the municipal authority in accordance with the city plan, the district plan, the national plan. Right? Now, there is planning in other places. So in every major city in the United States, with the exception of Houston, there are land use regimes that require, at least on paper, plans. There has to be a comprehensive plan before they have a land use zoning scheme that tells you what you can build and not build. But I'll give you a secret. Most places don't actually have plans. Right? And nevertheless, people build. Why? Because the way it works in the United States is opposite from the way it works here. You can do anything unless you're told not to. Right? If you want to put a nail in the outside wall, then unless there's something in the local zoning plan that tells you you may not, you're allowed to. Right? That's what it means to have your property rights. In Israel, the way it works is the other way around. You have to have a whole series of bureaucrats say okay before you can do anything. Now, this is linked to the next thing that happens. The next thing that happens, the way is the planning authorities see their job, and they view this as scientific, is they think that they're very, very good. They're better at gauging market demand than markets are. And so the way they want to do their planning, and this is uncontroversial even, the way they want to do their planning is to figure out what they think the demand is going to be in the next year and make sure that they've planned enough for it. And by the way, they never meet their targets, right? So here's, you know, you had a meeting about land planning, and in the construction industry, they're saying, well, they're not going to plan enough for the demand. There's going to be 75,000. There's going to be demand for 75,000 units, and there will only be plans for 30,000. And they talk about this as if the building is going to be done by the municipal authority, right? The planner, the way to look at it is this. If you want to build something in Israel, it ends up, you need two things. You need land, and you need land use permission, right? And you have to buy both of these things. And the way that the municipal authorities work is they're trying to figure out to give you the absolute minimum number of permissions to hit where they think the demand ought to be, right? I actually end up in discussions, so you can now smile. I end up with discussions with people who believe that they're in favor of free markets, but actually think it's a terrible thing for there to be permission to build more units than are actually going to be built, which is something I don't understand at all, right? Of course there should be. The point, the idea of having land use planning is not to try to stifle the market and throttle the demand so that only the supply, so it only hits what the bureaucrat thinks the demand should be. The idea is to protect from other things, from environmental troubles or whatever else it is that the land use planning authorities are trying to plan for, right? What number should the Tel Aviv municipality have plans for? 1 million. Why 30,000? Why 75,000? Right? Okay, so let's talk about some reforms. I'll talk about some bad ones. Well, some are okay. And then we'll talk about some good ones. Okay, this is the one good one that's been done, right? So this is actually relates to what we were talking about beforehand, right? So as I said, there was until very, very recently this wonderful tax shelter for the sale of residential units, right? And there have been over the years all these proposals. Let's try to cut this back, right? Let's at least take away this tax shelter when the residential unit is purely an investment vehicle, right? So there have been 2 changes. They're now in the process of being phased in that substantially do this. One of them is that the acquisition tax for second and third and fourth, that is additional residential units, is now much higher than the acquisition tax for a first unit. Second of all, after a transitional period that will end in 2017, you will only be able to sell a residential unit tax-free if it's the only one you own. If it's an additional one, then you will not get the capital gains exemption. What this means is that it greatly reduces the effectiveness of this tax shelter and therefore greatly reduces the subsidizing of real estate investment as an investment. Yeah.
So does that mean it only helps foreign investors and people who aren't...
Foreign investors don't get the exemption at all.
Oh.
Yeah, so they never got it. Pardon?
You have to be Israeli.
Yeah.
Right, so then it really only helps someone who owns a house and then sells it and moves somewhere else.
Yeah, basically it only covers, it's not restricted to the place where you reside, but since it's only, you only get one, right, since you only get one, it probably is. Right? Okay, so that's one good thing. Now let's get to one that's sort of less impressive. There was this huge reform that was passed with the Israel Lands Authority. It used to be called the Israel Lands Administration. But they had a big change, and now they're called the Israel Lands Authority. And they have more or less the same responsibilities, and they have more or less the same policies, but they changed their name. Okay, and when they're done selling off the urban units, we're going to get down to control of 91% instead of 93% of the Israeli lands. And while their policies for auctioning off have remained otherwise the same, this is supposed to be a big deal. We're supposed to be very excited. Okay. Now, one of the reasons that it's troublesome or difficult to change state ownership is because there actually is a law that insists that the state must own. This is our version of the 1917 Constitution of Mexico. I think it was Article 26, right? That says the state has to own the land. Now, there's a long list of exceptions, and if you think creatively about the exceptions, then the truth is we could get around it, right? We could get around state ownership in almost all cases. Or, you know, this is a novel thought, we could pass a new law. Shh. Yes?
What's the majority that we need to change it?
This one does not have, if I recall correctly, it's not entrenched. Right? It's like 2 to 1. Yes. Yeah. If I remember correctly, it does not have an entrenchment provision. Right. Was there something? No? Okay. Pardon? Well, 1 to 0. Yeah, 1 to 0. Any majority of people voting in the Knesset at that time. Okay. Now there's some bad arguments. Again, I'm going to be a little bit tendentious out here. There's some bad arguments that have been made over the years about why it is really important. This is from more from the right side of the camp on the top, and about equally in right and left towards the bottom, about why it is we need to have state ownership of land, right? Why we need to be Mexico. Right? So there are these defense arguments that it's necessary for the state to own land lest some rich Saudi come and buy up all the land and then put it in trucks and take it away to Saudi Arabia. Right? I've never quite understood the way this is supposed to work, what exactly the defense argument is. There have been, by the way, some interesting attempts over the years. Right? There was a Palestinian by the name of Faisal al-Husseini who was in charge of a Palestinian fund to buy up private land in Jerusalem. And he got lots of money from Gulf states, and I'm sure you've noticed that since then Jerusalem totally changed and now is entirely owned by the Saudis, right? Well, yeah, so now, this is not a thing that you can, it's not an easy thing to do. If you calculate the value of the real estate market, it's a practical impossibility, right, for a foreign enemy to buy this up. And worse is, you know, if they were going to do this, then buy up all the milk, right? Real estate ends up staying here anyway. You can't take it anywhere. What they end up doing is giving us lots of their cash. Yes?
First of all, they're not going to put contracts and take it to Saudi Arabia. They're planning to give it to other Arabs to live there. Second,
Yes.
they're planning to buy land in Yerucham. They
Yeah.
probably buy all the land in Jerusalem.
Yes,
It's not that
like Faisal Husseini did.
there is a law that's preventing it from doing that.
No, there isn't.
You just showed us one.
Pardon?
You just showed us one. The 2 slides.
Okay, so, right. And I told you the other thing was that in urban areas, that's the one place where there's actually private ownership. So if you want to think of the one place where it has absolutely no relevance, it's in Jerusalem, the state ownership. Right? Does state ownership prevent Saudis from buying up Jerusalem? No, the market does. It's not a practical plan. Okay? And by the way, owning land does not give you the right to immigrate to Israel, according to Israeli law. It never has. Right? So the Saudis buy up all the land in the state, every single grain. How many people can they import into Israel to live on it? 0.
2 million Palestinians?
Huh?
2 million Palestinians that
From
are
where?
looking for an apartment in Eastern Jerusalem, maybe.
They don't have a right to go move into East Jerusalem either.
They can force all the Jews not to live in Israel because this is not our land, you know? We have to live on the streets.
Please try it. You know, I want to see the Saudis take whatever number of trillions of dollars and try this plan. Okay, I think at the end of the day there will still be Jews living here and we'll be a lot richer. Now, there's another argument that's made, which has this one. Let's say it's more historically related, and the argument is something along the lines of this. You know, prior to 1948, and you could say, by the way, in some places now, when Israel had to negotiate its borders, or when what wasn't yet Israel had to negotiate its borders. Where Jews lived turned out to be really important in drawing those borders. Right? So real estate holdings are important for demographics, and demographics are important, were historically important for borders. And in certain areas, by the way, they still are. Right? Let's say along the Green Line. Right? And so what you can say is that maybe there's a reason why it's important to control who lives in those areas. Now, I'll just say that if that's true, again, it's not really true in Yerucham, right? Who cares about those places which there is no current possibility that the demographics will change borders. And second of all, about the last actor in the world who can control population by ownership is the state. Right? Because the state, as opposed to any other individual in Israel, may not discriminate. Right? And so it cannot, the one thing it cannot do is try to control the demographics of land so as to make it Jewish as opposed to Arab land. Right? If you think that state ownership is going to control the demographics for you, you've got it exactly wrong. All right. There's a third argument that's made, and this we'll skip this one. It's so silly, it's not even worth talking about. We'll go to the last one. All right. The last argument is this sort of populist argument. If there's a free market in lands, rich people will buy lands. And it will end up that only rich people have lands. Right? And it will be terrible. Poor people will have no place to live. It's like the way it is with food. There's a free market in food, and now only rich people can eat, and poor people can never buy anything. It's terrible. Yeah, how exactly the rich people are going to buy up all the lands, I'm not quite sure. Yes?
I'm not sure if the food situation is such a great example, being that food is so expensive.
It is, and yet still, you know, it's very, very difficult to corner a market. I'm not aware of any place in the world where rich people have taken over a free market. Right? There are places in the world where there's a very, very high degree of concentration of land ownership. And they all resulted from monarchical ownership that was passed down to lords, feudal lords. Right? And so that's what happened in several places in Europe. It's what happened in Hawaii. It's what happened in Latin America. Right? Now, that's a possibility only if you have state control. The state control is what empowers the people to take centralized large land holdings, right? It is impossible to do this. Believe me, it is impossible to do this in a free market. The amount of capital that would be required to corner a market on land is astronomical, and it's a very poor investment. Yeah.
Or maybe not all the land, but like in Israel, there's so little like coastline and maybe like, I don't know, springs and running water, so... Like,
so the coastline, yeah, you could have them monopolizing certain areas of the coastline, and thank goodness we have state ownership, therefore Herzliya never happened, right?
No,
I mean, it's much easier for powerful and rich people to control assets through state control than it is through a market. Right? Through a market, you have to put together an enormous amount of capital to get it. If there's state control, all you have to do is pay a bribe to, a mayor.
So you say anyway it's happening?
No, I'm saying it only can happen with state control. It cannot happen otherwise.
But like if I go to the States and I don't know, I see a lake and it's private, I can't go there. Like,
we're not talking about lakes, but you're talking about in the United States, if you go around, do you have any individuals who have mass land holdings enough to control a market? It doesn't exist. I can't think of a single market in the United States where a single mass landowner owns it, except there are places in Hawaii where it's like that. In Hawaii, that's not a result of market bias. It's a result of being handed down by the king of Hawaii before it was
so it can
a
be
state.
a situation like the whole around the Kinneret will be like part of the state and nobody can even see it.
Real estate is very expensive on the New Jersey shore, and yet people manage to swim in the New Jersey beaches anyway.
Because there's only one lake in Israel.
Yes, I understand. There's only one New Jersey shore, but yet people manage to swim there anyway. There's this huge reform going on right now in land use laws. What it's designed to do is not actually to change the fundamental concept. It'll still be forbidden to put a nail in the outside wall until you have all the levels of permission. What it's designed to do is to pass certain kinds of decisions from the district planning committees to the municipal planning committees, which, so far as it goes, is okay. Does it really change anything? No, not really. Right? So there's one more that I have to mention it just because it was in the news, right? There were two plans that were just adopted to revolutionize the market for real estate. So one of them is this gentleman's plan, and I was actually shocked to see him getting grilled on the news by an unfriendly interviewer. This is like the first time I can recall seeing that. Getting grilled for not understanding economics. So here was the question. He said, why do you think that giving a tax benefit to buyers in buying new apartments is going to lower the price of apartments? Won't it raise them? I believe that it's important to do something. We can't forget about the middle class. Yes, I understand that, but all the economists in your own ministry say it's going to result in raising the prices. It's important to do something. We cannot forget the middle class. Okay. Now, the other plan that's out there, this, by the way, is the better of the two. The other one that's out there is the housing minister got one passed, which will have auctions by the Israel Lands Authority, instead of going to the high bidder, going to the person who bids the lowest price per output unit. What does that mean? Does that mean there will be more building? No. What it means is that whatever building is done in state auctions will be of lower quality, right? How exactly this helps the middle class land buyer, I'm not quite sure. Okay, so what should we do? This is the part where I'm going to burst into tears if you shut me up. This is what we should be doing. And to me, it's a very simple thing. You know, there's the problem points to the solution, right? What should we do about mass state ownership of land? Not have it, right? Just don't have it. Sell off all the land that the state does not need for itself. Now, what percentage does the state need for itself in a country as small as Israel? Let's say probably more than it would in a country like Canada. Okay? Actually, there's a lot of state land holdings in Canada because it's mostly empty land and parks, right? But be it as it may, there's probably a lot of land. But let's say the amount is 50%. Okay? Okay, 50%. That leaves a lot of land out there to be sold. What else? For the planning, right? For planning, it seems a very simple thing. We don't need professional scientific planners to try to figure out what the market demands and then plan to release that number of building permissions. Just figure out what it is that if you build it will harm other people, right? Pollution, cutting off water streams, I don't know, whatever else, traffic density. There are lots of things that you can do that actually have to do with harm prevention that don't involve trying to figure out what the market demands. Everything else, go. Right? Now that's my simple solution to these two big problems. And with that, I will take as many questions as you will allow me to hear.
So what's the strategy to sell this to Israelis who aren't interested in this concept? Because it will endanger, the Saudis might move in, the rich people might take over. How do you sell it?
Well, there's a difference between what people will say is their preference in front of a TV camera and what they will actually do when you offer them an item to be bought, right? Will those people who believe it's a bad idea to sell off state land refrain from participating in auctions? I doubt it. I think they'll buy just like everyone else. I'll ask you something more, by the way. How many of those people who think it's a terrible thing because maybe the Saudis might buy up the country are refusing, now with the Israel Land Authority, is giving them ownership of their apartments inside cities today. How many of them are refusing to take it on principled grounds because the Saudis might take over? I can guarantee you it hasn't yet happened, right? There may be this expressed preference, but I don't think that it's going to translate into any different demand for buying up land when the auctions come. Yes?
So let's say you want to build a pool in your brand new home that first leads to
yes.
Besides getting that permission from the city, you would have to grease the wheel to someone in the land authority to allow you to make this.
Today, the way it works? The way it works is depends on the way the lease is structured. But for most things, like that, like a pool, if it's already in the building plan, if it's already in the municipal plan, then all you have to do is buy the permit. If it's not in the municipal plan, then it's not in your lease either. And what that means is that you have to pay the Israel Lands Authority a fee. They'll generally have a set fee for the amount that you have to pay to have the lease changed. You then have to go and try to lobby to get the municipal plan changed, right? Or to get an exception to the municipal plan, right? Which means probably you have to know somebody in the, in City Hall, right? And then you go. Then after all those changes, which will be about 5 years from now, and let's say several thousands, you will then go buy your permit, right? There's a reason why it's a joke, but look, in Israel you have this standard thing. People want to enclose their porches, right? And okay, now, in general, this is something that is not allowed by the local plan. If you want to do so, you can't just go get a permit. You have to lobby to have the plan changed, and only then can you get a permit. And so, the professor who taught land use law in Jerusalem for 40 years ended up illegally closing his porch because you're not going to get the change unless you want to wait 20 years. Eat, right? Eat? Okay. Thank you very, very much.